What are we doing here, hun?
Today we're going to use our sourdough starter discard to make pizza flatbreads. Because we're making it for pizza, we have a certain amount and kind of the seasoning that we're going to use. In this one, I like to use the nutritional yeast because it gives it a little bit of a cheesy flavor. We're also going to use oregano, basil, and then onion and garlic powder. But you can vary whatever kinds of spices that you use in the flatbread depending on what you use it for. But usually when I feed my sourdough starter, I make flatbread dough on the same day. It is a 2-day recipe. Your flatbread dough needs to sit in the refrigerator overnight. Actually, it only needs to sit for an hour, but usually I'm not that organized. So I make it the day before. It sits in the refrigerator for a day, and then I make the flatbreads the next day. If you waited, I'd say up to 3 days in the refrigerator, the dough will last. So you can make it a couple days in advance and just let it sit in there. But let's get started. I've already measured out the sourdough discard that I need. When I make this, even though the recipe doesn't put things in this order, I put all the wet ingredients in first. So I'm going to add my milk. I am making the 360 gram of sourdough mix, so it's 1.5 times the original recipe. So since I've got 360 grams of sourdough discard, I'm going to put in 168 grams of milk. A lot of times I put in some extra sourdough starter and also a little bit of extra milk, just like a couple grams, especially if I'm going to use the nutritional yeast because it's a little bit dry, and my theory is that it kind of needs a little bit more stuff to absorb. The next ingredient that's wet is the olive oil. We're going to put in 1.5 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. Then we just give it a good stir, make sure it's nicely incorporated. I'll admit that I don't always measure the olive oil. I just sometimes I just glug it in there. Seems to turn out just fine, but I thought since we're making a video, I'll measure. So the next thing we add are the spices. You're supposed to measure the spices. No, I'm lying. You don't measure the spices. I just throw them in there.
What's your best guess as to how much that was?
I don't have any idea.
Come on. That's at least a tablespoon.
After I add the spices, I just give it another stir just to make sure they're kind of nicely incorporated. And now the mixture looks like this. Then we put in the flour, salt, and the baking powder. So back on the tray it goes. Zero it out. We're doing 360 grams of sourdough starter, so we're doing 360 grams of flour. On the money. 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I keep my salt in this mason jar. Makes it super easy to measure out for baking. Same amount again of the baking powder, not baking soda, that you had for salt, so 1.5 teaspoons. I spent good money on this baking powder container, and then since then I've just been reusing it because it's easy to measure out of this, so then I just buy the cheap stuff and refill it. So now we just give it a good stir. So I get it to look about like this, and then I take off my rings because we have to use our hands. All we're really doing is kneading in the bowl. Keeps the counter cleaner, then you don't have to wipe off the counter so much. You can see that the dough is what they call tacky. So with a clean hand, you can touch it and it feels sticky, but it doesn't come up with your finger. And that's what you're kind of going for. You don't want too sticky, but you don't want it to be too dry. The flour will hydrate and absorb some of the moisture, but that will actually kind of make it less sticky. So it's okay if it feels a little bit sticky. I also find that using the all-purpose flour, and that's what we've used in here, works really well. It can be a little bit stickier if you are using like a whole wheat because it doesn't absorb as quickly the liquids. The directions say to knead for a few minutes. I probably do a minute. Now, because I've been kneading with my right hand, it is starting to stick, and I've got pieces on my right hand that are starting to stick. And so you might be a little bit panicked that, oh no, it's too wet, but you just do the test again with a clean hand. So these guys have a little dough, so that one has no dough. Yeah, so it's still good. Now all we do is wrap it up in some saran wrap. Really good because it will rise a little bit in the fridge now that you've fed the sourdough. And like I said, we're just going to leave it overnight and we will make our sourdough pizza flatbreads tomorrow. And we're back. We are about to start making our flatbreads. I've just taken this out of the refrigerator. I don't let it warm up because as it gets warmer, it's a little bit harder to work with. It's actually been 2 rounds of flatbread since I made those first couple videos. So this flatbread is 6 servings. So the first step is to weigh it out and then divide that by 6. So 632 grams divided by 6, 105-ish. So I will just take this, unwrap it, and measure out my 6 105-gram balls of dough. So a couple things. I've got a little plastic sheet to protect my scale. I keep the wrapper because I'm going to cover the balls as I form them. And the pan has been preheating on my stove. It's probably low medium. Now the key for cooking these is to have a cast iron pan. It really needs to be cast iron. They will get the best finish. If you have any other kind of pan, like even a non-stick, it doesn't quite work. My mother made them in a non-stick pan. She said they were terrible. So really important to have the right kind of pan. It's basically one of the few times I ever use that pan anyway. All right, let's get to measuring. Okay, first one, it's at exactly 105. What I usually do is a little stretch and then form it into a small ball. And then if you cup your hand like this, it makes a lovely roll shape. So a little stretch and fold and then a little rolling. So you can stretch and fold a couple of times, and as you stretch and fold, you'll feel if your dough is a little bit damp. Mine is a little bit wetter than normal, but you'll feel it start to come together as you stretch and fold. As you're doing the stretch and fold, do it a couple times in one direction. If it tears, that's fine, but then do it in the other direction. So you make a bit of a box. When I get down to the last couple, I just kind of make sure they're sort of similar in size and that I haven't gotten off somehow in my measuring. Okay, we're all done rolling out the balls. We can put away the scale, and the next step is to start forming them. So I'm not using my normal all-purpose flour. I'm out. So I'm just going to substitute bread flour. I make a little pile of bread flour, and you'll see why in a second. You don't want to get flour all over your surface. The more flour you add to your flatbreads, the tougher they are going to be. So you do want them to be a little bit kind of sticky. So there's a nice rhythm that goes with making these. As one is cooking, you're rolling out the next one. What we'll need now is also a small bowl of olive oil with a brush. And I've got I was using my awesome bench scraper. We'll use that. We'll keep it out because we're going to use it to clean up. And then I just have a regular rolling pin. Okay, here we go. Now the first one is kind of like when you're making pancakes. You know how the first pancake you make, it's not always the greatest. Often the first one of these that I make is a little bit thicker. I think it's because it's colder. So the rest of them start warming up and they work out a little bit better, but sometimes not. Sometimes the first one's good. So what I do is I roll it in the flour and I shape it a little bit off of the table and then just put it down on the table and roll it out. So you can see a couple things happened. First of all, it's not round. Second, it's sticking to the counter. I want it to stick to the counter because that helps me get it thinner. This is nothing to worry about. Watch what happens. Step 1, to put in the pan, we need to give it a nice brush of olive oil. The first one in particular, I like to make sure it gets a good glob of olive oil on it because the pan is a little bit dry. When I pick it up, I try to think about how is it shorter and pick up on that shorter side. If you get a hole in it, it's no big deal. There, it's almost round now. Okay. So picking up on a side that's shorter and carry it over. Try not to drip oil on the floor. Sticks to my fingers a little bit, that's okay. Try not to burn yourself. And then give it a little swirl. Then you don't have anything sticking to the pan. Like I said, this is a little bit harder on the first one, but after that they get real easy. If you get a bit of dough that sticks to the pan, just use the next pita to kind of mop it up, and it will come off very easily. If you flip it over and you don't feel like it's dark enough, just flip it back over, give it a couple minutes, or sorry, couple seconds, maybe 30 on the other side, and it should just brown up nicely. It doesn't matter, sort of, if you have to flip it a few times. It won't affect the quality. So here's a good example of a bubble that you want to pop. I just mash it down. If you don't pop the bubble, it won't get brown on that particular part on the other side. So I just mash it down and that's good enough. We're getting close to being done for this one. Oh yeah, that looks pretty good. So just flip it over. You can pop a couple holes on the top too. Again, I use these mostly for pizza, so I don't want big bubbles in them. While it's cooking, I do two things. First, I brush the back of it, so when I flip it over, there's plenty of oil on the other side, and then I'll start doing the next little ball. If you happen to splash a little olive oil on the counter, try to get it off. It does make rolling them out a little more difficult, but it doesn't stick to that part. Probably the most difficult thing is waiting for them to cook. I cook them at a kind of a lower temperature than maybe I could. I could do them a little bit higher, but I'm loath to get them too dark. So sometimes when I'm doing this project, I also have something else going on so that I can kind of go back and forth. But it's in the kitchen because they only do take a couple minutes each side before they turn nice and dark. So we're almost done. As they come out of the pan, I put them hot side up and then arrange them so that they have a better chance of cooling. And then when I'm done with them, they either get eaten right away with some tzatziki or hummus, or you can wrap them up in packs of however many, 4 if you have 4 people. The recipe makes 6. Sometimes I 1.5 it, so I have 9. So I have 2 packs, a 4 and a 5. And then they can go right in the freezer. I do always use the Glad press and seal, not sponsored. But it keeps them really fresh in our freezer, which is not the greatest and gets frostburn on everything. I'll keep them in there only about a month before I take them out. But it's a really easy recipe. I've probably made it, I don't know, 100 times. Every time it's slightly different, so you just make adjustments. It is a bread product, so the moisture in the air, etc., can change everything, but I do hope you try it. If you have ideas about other spices that you might want to put in there or anything else, please make a comment below, and thanks everybody, and stay awesome.
Did you say 1.5?
That's 1.5.
What?
have a 1.5 tablespoon. It's really convenient.
You're gonna have to flip that. It says 1.5. I can see it.